Now we're going to get down to the nitty-gritty of what Indians are all about.
I still say we Indian people are believers in the truth. This is the way of life that was given to your people. You're born an Indian, you're going to die an Indian. Indianness is a good life. You're facing an Indian this afternoon.
Thursday, July 23rd, the Mvskoke Creek Nation National Council will vote on NCA 20-037, a law creating a new Title 49 entitled Independent Mvskoke Creek Press. NCA 20-037 has been endorsed by the Native American Journalists Association and features language adopted from the Red Press Initiative. If enacted, this law will re-establish Mvskoke Media as an independent statutory executive agency, removing it from its current position in the Department of Commerce. The editorial board will have new appointees seated who will have the powers to review and approve the annual departmental budget and hire and advise the Mvskoke Media director. This law ensures that Mvskoke Media editorial staff shall perform duties free from political influence from any department of the government of the Mvskoke Creek Nation and can only be removed for cause by the Mvskoke Media director. If you are a citizen who values free press at the Mvskoke Creek Nation, contact your National Council representative and tell them to vote yes on NCA 20-037.
So I just want to say welcome everyone to our weekly press briefing, and I have a great packed house today to talk about freedom of the press, and joining me via Zoom, which is a wonderful bit of technology that we have just embraced fully during COVID, is Rebecca Lansbury, who is the executive director of NAJA, and Brian Pollard, who is an associate director at NAJA, Rita Courtwright, managing editor of Mvskoke Media, Jason Salzman, as always, in the house, representing the executive branch as the Mvskoke Creek Nation press secretary. So we have lots to talk about. Big bill coming up for Mvskoke Media. We're going to be looking and watching as the council considers a freedom of press or independent media bill as it's prescribed. And I just wanted to pick everyone's brain first off about we're going to try to dive into what the topic means to Indian country and maybe just a little bit of an oversight of what has gone into the drafting of this bill and why it's important, why it is the way that it's set up. And then, of course, we'll kind of pick Jason's brain on the executive branch's feelings about free press. And then Rita Courtwright here to kind of talk about the future of media at the Mvskoke Creek Nation and what kind of work we have in store for us here. So just kind of welcome everyone. Thank you, Brian. Thank you, Becca, Rita, Jason, for tuning in. And I kind of want to start off a little bit with setting up free press as what it means to Indian country. And Brian, I think you're a great person to talk on that, especially with your involvement in the Red Press Initiative. Can you tell us a little bit about that project and what it meant to dissect what people actually think about how the press is being represented in Indian country?
So we started the Red Press Initiative at the Native American Journalists Association a few years ago because we understood anecdotally that press freedom was really inconsistent in Indian country. Some communities have a very strong press, others they may not have those freedoms. And we knew that we had all heard the stories about it, but there wasn't really any data. The problem had not been quantified. And so we started the Red Press Initiative to really start gathering data so that we could develop a more quantifiable understanding of the problem. And that way, hopefully develop a more generalizable solution that can be applied to a wide variety of communities across Indian country, kind of no matter where they are on the spectrum of press freedom, right? And so with that as the background, we've now conducted a survey. We conducted the survey across We pushed it out across all of Indian country. We had about 500 respondents. And so we're still in the process of kind of crunching that data and seeing what it looks like. But hopefully we're going to have something that we can present soon, and it will also be appearing on our NAJA website once we have it.
Is there any early indications that you're seeing that something, any trends that you can kind of tackle right now and identify?
I would say that the data does support a lot of the stories that we've heard, in the sense that there are definitely tribal media producers, meaning people who work for tribal media, that are reporting that they experience censorship, that they experience the requirement to receive prior approval before they can publish, that are experiencing harassment from tribal officials as they try to report on tribal affairs. And so those things are definitely apparent in the data, and we look forward to rolling that out.
Okay, wonderful. Not so much that wonderful that we have that kind of thing going on, but wonderful that we're able to kind of quantify it in the numbers and actually show what's going on. Hey, Becca, can you just kind of clue us in a little bit about like NAJA's overall role in Native American media and what you guys stay busy with, and how you've been such an asset to the Mvskoke Creek Nation in this journey of free press? I mean, we've had it, it's rolled back, we're seeing legislation come up again. What's been your role as the Native American Journalists Organization in helping facilitate that kind of a conversation, a support?
Sorry, Angel, if that one was directed at me, I'm sorry if I missed the first part of it. My my headphones cut out, so I apologize.
No, we're just kind of like wanting to build for the audience like what NAJA's role in supporting free press in Indian country is, and how you guys have specifically helped with the Mvskoke Creek Nation's draft of legislation.
Yeah, absolutely. So Brian talked a little bit about the Red Press Initiative, which is, a project of NAJA. And, one of the big things that we as an organization that's, been around for more than 35 years now, since the 70s, we were really founded on this idea of, empowering tribal media. And I'll go back to some earlier research that we did with the Native Health News Alliance, and that was around 2014. And one of the questions that we had in a survey that we did for that, which was a grant project, was asking people where their most trusted forms of news were in Indian country. And the majority of respondents to that survey said, that they trust their tribal media the most to report on things that are happening within that tribe. So more than mainstream media, they trust tribal media to get stories right and to make sure that, that coverage is accurate in covering that particular community. So, NAJA as an organization was born out of the need for, accurate representation of tribal communities in media, and wanting to empower those tribal journalists to be able to do their job and to make sure that they were able to report without, interference from the government in any, branch or any capacity. So that's really where we're coming from when we have, built these projects, built our resources that, we have a series of reporting guides that help mainstream media and tribal media report on Indian country accurately and ethically. So I think that's, kind of where we're coming from in our resource base when we house things like, I think we have all of the I guess they're more like templates. They're copies of the legislation that we host on the NAJA website that tribes can come in and access at any time and, base potential free press legislation on, which is kind of what we did to help Mvskoke media along the process back in 2015 and leading up to where we're at today in 2020. So those are a really great resource for any, tribal media outlet who's looking to introduce free press protections at the legislative level. They can go on and take the parts that they need to, which I think speaks to, the strengths of this legislation specifically. It has elements from a lot of different a lot of the different templates that really make it a strong bill and support free press. So I'm really excited to dig into it, and hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of, what NAJA does as one of our, kind of the tenets of the organization.
Before we dive into all the components of this particular legislation, I wanted to kind of point out the just juxtaposition of this situation that tribal media often finds itself in. On the one hand, we have our audience saying that they trust more than anyone else the journalists in Native American, organizations to report on Native American issues. And then yet you have the data backing up the fact that many of these reporting entities are experiencing some form of censorship. Can you kind of speak to the atmosphere that kind of, fosters that to happen? Because I feel like from my point of view, I often see myself covering stories that, and Jason can probably attest to this even too, that maybe Channel 6, Channel 8, Fox 23, they just don't really, it doesn't get their, attention as much as it would get mine. So can you kind of talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I do think that there is, a great responsibility placed on tribal media, because it is your own community. And so you have that responsibility to, report accurately and fairly on your own community. And then there's also, there's a challenge from, the citizens, who is ultimately who we have to be responsible to as citizens and reporters that are, working in tribal media outlets. So I realize there can be a rub sometimes between, if you're a tribal media experiencing pushback from, your tribal government and report this, don't report this, but you're ultimately being responsible, to those citizens for making sure your information is accurate and it's ethical and it's complete and with context. So that's where, sometimes that conflict can come into play, and it puts, tribal media reporters like yourself, kind of in the middle of this back and forth in a position you never signed up for. And you're just trying to do your job, trying to report accurately and fairly, and, uphold those journalism ethics that you signed on for as a journalist. So, really creates a tough position for tribal media reporters sometimes in trying to please, both sides, when really what they should be focused on is making sure that the citizens have that accurate information too. So it is an unfortunate problem. And again, that's one of the reasons, NAJA was founded, is, to kind of create a network of support for those journalists who are facing that issue. It's so unique to Indian country. And, and other journalists, you have issues that you're facing in journalism and accurate representation in general, but nowhere else, in the U.S. Is facing these types of specific issues that we have in Indian country when it comes to, reporting as tribal media outlets. And each tribe has its own unique relationship with their tribal media outlet. And, there's a handful of tribes right now that have free press protections at the legislative level. None that have it at the constitutional level, which is a whole, that's a whole other level of protection. But as a starting point, I think to have the bill coming up and it be a really strong bill at the legislative level, I think it's exciting to, see that come to pass and hopefully provide some protection and a buffer between, the administration and the outlet itself for Mvskoke media.
So specifically talking on the components of this bill, what is it, and this is a question for anybody who wants to field it, what is it specifically that makes the bill strong, and what are we looking at as those components of providing some protections? I mean, nobody has to have enough protection that you could never lose your job, but as a journalist, you want to know that when you're out there just kind of doing your job, that you have the ability to do so. Because the argument that you often see brought up, and this is specific to not probably tribes, because many times it's the tribes footing the bill, but what are the components that you set up to help with that when it is in fact the tribe putting the funding forth to bring the information to the people? Anybody? Brian, you're probably the guy for that one.
Well, there's a couple of things that I would touch on because they're both incredibly important, and maybe the other panelists can expand on it. One is having an editorial board. You absolutely have to have a board that is somewhat independent, that can not only set fair policy that governs the editorial practices of the organization, but that also serves as something of a political buffer between the government and the organization so that they can do their jobs and have editorial freedom. And so I think having an impartial editorial board is absolutely essential. The second thing is budgetary protection. One of the things that we saw in our survey data was that about a quarter of tribal media producers reported that they think that their content is influenced by budgetary pressures. In other words, the government may open or close the purse strings based on whether they like or dislike what is being published in tribal media, and that's extremely troubling. And so there has to be some sort of firewall or protection in place so that the purse strings can't be used to influence coverage.
So one of the things I like to point out, and I've had many side conversations with government officials and things like that who are trying to learn about this process, and I almost see that editorial board as a safety net for every entity involved. If somebody is really upset at a story that I've written, and they run to the chief's office and say, I just don't like that reporter and what she wrote, and then the chief has the freedom to say, well, there is this board in place and there is this process in place, and that's the way we navigate our complaints. And then also from the journalist perspective, if an official who does control funding, like you said, has a vote in our funding, is really upset about an issue, and rather than just saying, well, I'm slashing out of that budget, that particular person's salary, then they have a navigating process too by which they can lodge complaints, and that kind of works both ways. It can work for the person whose boots are on the ground getting the information, and then it can also work for elected officials who need to present themselves in a transparent manner. They say, hey, we've set aside this process outlined in law, and this is how we follow it. Any thoughts on comparing that to, say, like the state level? Because I've kind of seen instances where the state of Oklahoma has public funds for public information, and to some degree. I mean, we see these organizations like OETA and things like that. They do have some stake in that. So it's not completely out of the realm of possible when you see government funding going to, citizen access to information, is it?
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And I think that, that model for tribal media, it makes a lot of sense to me as, kind of a publicly, funded entity that is, providing a public service to citizens. And for the administration to, acknowledge that service and say, we're going to make sure that you're funded because you're providing an essential service to the citizens. I think it's really progressive to me as an idea for them to take that perspective and see the value that tribal media bring to that too. And I'll also add to what Brian said too about the editorial board and its importance too. I think it's really great to see that we're basically, with this bill, would be adding Mvskoke media representation back in. So with the current legislation that's in place, it doesn't actually have direct representation on the editorial board. I think one is designated by the legislative branch, one by the executive branch, and then with amongst themselves, they select the third member. So this legislation would change that slightly to allow for representation by both the executive branch, the legislative branch, as well as a direct representative for Mvskoke media, which I think is a really great model to adopt in this version of the bill.
Karen Medina is asking a question here. It says, she's asking, so there are no tribes as of yet that have free press protection at the constitutional level. Is that correct?
Yes, none at the constitutional level. Brian may want to expand on that. Did you have
I'll actually say, so part of my research with the Red Press Initiative was to look at tribal constitutions. And what I found actually is that there is a lot of dissonance between what tribes enshrine in their constitutions and what we're seeing practiced out in the field, because many tribes actually do protect free press and free speech in their constitutions. When tribes started adopting constitutional frameworks in 1934, after the Indian Reorganization Act, we saw some great language that were placed in constitutions that really gave tribal citizens unfettered access to free speech and free press. And then in 1968, there was another legislation that was passed, the Indian Civil Rights Act, which basically gave language within the act itself that was very similar to the First Amendment. And it said that tribes shall make no law that prohibits free press or free speech. And so between those two types of language, back from the 30s and 40s into the 60s and 70s, we actually see those press protections across a very broad swath of tribal constitutions. The problem is that we're not seeing that being practiced. And so we need to find a way to bridge that gap between what tribes are saying they value in their constitutions versus what's being practiced.
And there is a whole other alphabet in between there shall not be anything against and there shall be. So there's always that.
Yeah.
Jason, have you gotten any feel on the climate of the executive branch? We're what are we, 48 hours out from, I don't know which version, how often we've been 48 hours out since November of 2018, but here we are again. Like, what's the feel on the executive branch side? How's our leadership thinking in the executive branch? Are they ready to do away with us?
No, very, very excited. Our executive branch, our current executive branch, voted for us back in 2018 when free press was repealed. And then our current principal chief actually sponsored and brought forth a free press bill to try to save free press afterwards. So obviously our two executive, if you're a free press guy or a free press girl, these are your guys as far as, wanting to have them in there and be supportive of this. I think that the principal chief is very happy speaking, on behalf of him, talking about Naja's involvement in this, and Rebecca and Brian. Respect you guys so much. Worked with you guys for a long time. We've been colleagues, we've been friends, but we've also been people that discussed really the spirit of this issue that we're talking about. Not only in spirit, but in practice, how we make it work at our tribes, how we make it work at other tribes. Not every shoe fits everybody equally on this issue. We have certain tribes that we've talked about that still aren't even where we are, that still have a long way to go. And they've got good journalists there. They've got people that are passionate about telling their citizens what's going on and having open dialogue. And listen, this isn't always fun. As tribal nations, we have scars. We have great stories to tell. We have sad stories to tell. We have controversial stories to tell. So if you're getting into tribal politics in 2020, just be prepared. I think you should be prepared to answer tough questions to the best of your ability, but also welcome that, because that's the only way we can grow as tribes, and we can sort of leave behind instances what we saw back in 2018, where I just think that there was a fundamental misunderstanding of what this means for Mvskoke Creek Nation, because you see things like, for instance, when we were talking earlier, I was kind of making little notes about what everyone was saying, and kind of, okay, we can speak on that. But I think when we talk about tribes, we're a unique communal people. It's hard to have an unbiased editorial board because we all know each other in some form or fashion. And there's a lot of people in Indian country that know each other and work together, have grown up together, things like that. It's hard to also have our own people maybe put others in the spotlight or in the news that you may know or that you may have worked with or been friends with. And we even heard on that fateful day in 2018 that just broke all of our hearts. We even heard the words uttered, I just think there's too much negativity about us in our newspaper. I think what's negative is up to the citizens to decide, not for the folks that put the things in the paper or that are reading the paper, things like that. So, for me, there are challenges, but it's so much more worth it. And I know the executive branch, like I said, so happy that we were able to get NAJA involvement and sort of some red line edits and things like that, to where we don't need to rush. We need to get the perfect press bill that's unrepealable. How about that? I think that's what we want to get. We want to get something that you can't poke holes in, that you can't say we need to go back and take a look at this. We need to get it right, everything like that. So I can speak for the executive branch, say they're very pleased to at least see us to this point of this journey back here again. As
a person who was back on staff on that day, I can honestly say that day I was completely stunned to hear the there's too much bad news, because I never saw an email or suggestion saying that you should probably balance this with something a little more lighthearted. And that is something that we try to consciously keep up with. Are we hammering too much legal news at people? Do we need some features? So it kind of just blindside out of nowhere. And it was like, there's this process to use, and please use it to communicate with us, because that's who we do work for the people. But one thing I haven't heard from the public at large was them feeling like a need to repeal free press. I've never heard a citizen utter that. An elected official actually just felt there was too much bad news. But my answer to that is I would trust the bad news of my community more to myself and my reporting rather than the New York Times doing it, because some people just get news in Indian country really, really wrong on a regular basis. And that's why people like me still have jobs, is to kind of come in and actually look at these scenarios and communicate with who we need to communicate with, and do that in a manner that's respectful of our community and represents our community as well as we can. Rita, we've got big work ahead. Can you just give me like a rundown of what, like, if this passes on Thursday, what are we looking at? What are we staring down here?
Man, this is a really exciting time for me. As some of you may or may not know, I came in here, and can you all hear me? Okay, I'm sorry. I came in here back in 2018, about 3 weeks before all of that happened, and I was unsure of what I was walking into. So it has definitely been a learning process. I definitely look forward to having an editorial board to help me make with these decisions. While there has been an editorial board in place, they're just not as active maybe as I would assume that an editorial board should be. So it's been really challenging for me over the last year and a half, almost 2 years, to be in this position. Now that we're here and it looks like maybe we might have a shot at this free press legislation, I'm excited of what's around the corner, what we can do. I hope to expand on our reporters and get some more reporters in here. Lately, we've been running the newspaper just on 3 staff members, and hopefully we can change that and get some more staff in here and expand out the area in which we cover, I guess is the best way to look at it. Get more news out and make it more timely. I definitely want to work on, I love these things that Jared does on YouTube, getting these YouTube out there so that citizens can watch it right now, or they can watch it at their own time slot. So that's a good thing. I want to get the paper and all of that information updated online as quickly as possible, so that we can be the first, like Angel had mentioned to me before, the first to break a story dealing with Mvskoke Creek Nation, as opposed to other news entities who've been before us and who've broke the story before us. I want to be that person who does that.